I'd now like to introduce you to Carolina Elices, who will be giving a paper called The Preservation of Memories, Histories, Fellowships and Fraternities, Human Association in Architecture in Far From the Madding Crowd. And quite frankly, I don't think there is enough written about architecture in Hardy's works, which is quite surprising as he was an architect. So Carolina recently received her master's in English Literary Studies from the University of York. She has a bachelor's in art history and English from Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut, where she first discovered Thomas Hardy and the pleasures of reading his work. May I please introduce Carolina?
Thank you for having me. As you can see, the title of my talk is The Preservation of Memories, Histories, Fellowships, Fraternities, Human Association and Architecture in Far From the Madding Crowd. So I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, are passionate fans of the famed Victorian novelist and poet Thomas Hardy, who wrote such works as Tess of the D'Urbervilles, Jude the Obscure, and of course, Far From the Madding Crowd, which we are here to celebrate today. What many people don't know about Hardy, however, is that he pursued a career in architecture before he became an author. Now, you may be asking yourself, what do architecture and Far From the Madding Crowd have in common? Nothing perhaps at face value, but as I will show, Hardy's work in architecture taught him to value the link between architectural spaces and human connection, an important and recurring concept in Far From the Madding Crowd. During his brief architectural career, which lasted from when he was apprenticed at 16 in 1856 until 1872, when he chose writing for good, Hardy specialized in church restoration. This may sound like a straightforward architectural career, but in fact, during the 19th century, a debate raged on what exactly was the best course of action when conserving older buildings. On the one hand, Victorian restorationists believed old historical buildings serve practical purposes. As it ages, therefore, an old building should be remade in new materials in order to continue to discharge its original function. The Ecclesiological Society, an important restorationist group founded in 1845, sought to restore churches to their best and purest style. This usually meant restoring only one privileged moment of a church's many periods. So if a church had Norman, Gothic, and Georgian styles, the architect would pick one of these styles and make the rest of the building conform to it. In order to achieve this goal, the society often resorted to demolishing and then reconstructing buildings, or taking out various elements and moving others around. The restorationist agenda could be comprehensive and merciless in its willingness to sacrifice existing features of a building in the name of a particular style and function, especially as preservationists saw it. Preservationists such as John Ruskin and Hardy, on the other hand, believed that a building, by nature of having existed for many years, possessed a unique history that should be protected. Thus, the building should remain in its functionally deficient but association-rich original state. In his 1849 Seven Lamps of Architecture, John Ruskin decries restoration as, quote, the most total destruction which a building can suffer. Do not let us talk then of restoration. The thing is alive from beginning to end. You may make a model of a building as you may of a corpse, and your model may have the shell of the old walls within it, as your cast might have the skeleton, but the old building is destroyed, and that more totally and mercilessly than if it had sunk into a heap of dust or melted into a mass of clay. Thus, to preservationists, efforts to remake portions of a historically rich building destroyed rather than restored it. The preservationist's ultimate goal was to preserve as much of a building as possible, including different parts from different periods of its history, in order to leave its historic and emotional associations intact. Hardy's speech, Memories of Church Restoration, which was presented at a 1906 meeting of the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, or SPAB, a preservationist group founded by William Morris, clarifies the difference between restoration and preservation. To Hardy, who echoes Ruskin, restoration is, quote, active destruction under saving names. Moreover, Hardy states, quote, "The essence and soul of an architectural monument does not lie in the particular blocks of stone or timber that compose it, but in the mere forms to which these materials have been shaped. These forms that shape a monument include, quote, human association, and preserving historic architecture represents the, quote, preservation of memories, history, fellowships, fraternities, the quote in the first half of this talk's title. To restore and thereby replace elements of a building meant destroying those historical and human associations. Ultimately, to Hardy, the conflict between restoration and preservation is a moral conflict, quote, between the purely aesthetic sense and the memorial or associative. Hardy thinks that, quote, the protection of an ancient edifice against renewal and fresh materials is a humane duty. He thus distinguishes between what he considers the superficial, emotionless claims for restoration and the thoughtful, emotional vision of preservation. Preservation for Hardy is more than just a specific technique for caring for a historical building. It is also a means of protecting the memories and history that are intimately connected to architectural space. Where did Hardy develop his passionate support for preservation? His work in church restoration seems to be precisely what turned him against this practice in favor of preservation. One particular restoration that may have turned Hardy against the practice was his work on the Church of St. Juliet in Cornwall. In February 1870, Hardy was asked to get a plan of the church by his boss, G.R. Crickmay, since this particular church was falling into disrepair. While there, Hardy met the woman who was to become his beloved first wife, Emma Gifford. Hardy's sketch of the church before alteration, which he included in his architectural notebook, demonstrates just how drastically it was changed. The tower in the sketch was completely rebuilt during Crickmay's restoration of the church, but remained in its original position. Meanwhile, as Hardy notes in his drawing, the old nave was transformed into an aisle, and the south aisle became the nave, with the transept being completely destroyed. The drastic changes made in this restoration to the church may have prompted this reaction from Hardy in his 1928 autobiography when he referred to August 1870. Quote, "It was at this time, too, that he saw the last of St. Juliet Church in its original condition of picturesque neglect, the local builder laying hands on it shortly after and razing to the ground the tower and the north aisle, which had hitherto been the nave and the transept. Hardy much regretted the obliteration in this manner of the church's history, and, too, that he should be instrumental in such obliteration, the building as he had first set eyes on it having been so associated with what was romantic in his life." Here, Hardy regrets and laments his contributions to the restoration, or in his mind, destruction of St. Juliet. This restoration is particularly meaningful and regrettable for him because it is of such deep emotional import, since the church was the means of meeting his beloved first wife. When Hardy wrote of the memories, history, fellowships, fraternities contained in historical buildings and his memories of church restoration, he may have been referring to a moment such as this. The St. Juliet building in its original state would have contained the memories, history, and development of a fellowship between Hardy and Emma. Altering the building from that state would mean, for Hardy, removing his emotional ties to the church in the process. His emotional investment in the church's condition may have helped him to realize the importance of preservation as well as the extent of restoration's potential destruction. The emotional ramifications of the restoration of St. Juliet point toward Hardy's turning away from restoration in favor of preservation. What I hope I have shown so far is how Thomas Hardy's brief architectural career in restoring historical buildings deeply convinced him of the connection between architectural spaces and their human associations. Hardy's concerns about place and memory did not end with the termination of his architectural career. Rather, he explored the various conflicts that arise when the connection between place and memory is threatened, as well as the positive effects of maintaining an architectural space, and therefore the memories associated with it in such novels as Far from the Madding Crowd. Throughout Far from the Madding Crowd, Hardy's lengthy descriptions of buildings anticipate the forms of human interaction that take place within the building described. According to Hardy, the human associations of memories, history, fellowships, fraternities contained in historic buildings are a primary means for keeping a building in as much in its original state as possible. 3 buildings described at length in Far from the Madding Crowd are the Great Barn, the Buck's Head Inn, and Weatherbury Church. Each building is associated with a different one of the human relationships Hardy names in his conception of preservation. The Great Barn is where history is relayed, the Buck's Head Inn fosters fraternity, and Weatherbury Church contains memories. The Great Barn's continuity with its past history and usage represents the ideal application of preservation principles to architecture. The Great Barn is described as follows. They sheared in the Great Barn, which on ground plan resembled a church with transepts. It not only emulated the form of the neighboring church of the parish, but vied with it in antiquity. One could say about this barn what could hardly be said of either the church or the castle, akin to it in age and style, that the purpose which had dictated its original erection was the same with that to which it was still applied. Unlike and superior to either of these two typical remnants of medievalism, the old barn embodied practices which had suffered no mutilation at the hands of time. Here, at least, the spirit of the ancient builders was at one with the spirit of the modern beholder. Standing before this abraded pile, the eye regarded its present usage, the mind dwelt upon its past history, with a satisfied sense of functional continuity throughout, a feeling almost of gratitude, and quite of pride at the permanence of the idea which had heaped it up. Here, history is preserved by continuing the practices of the past in the present. The barn seamlessly combines past history with the present. It does not need restoration because it maintains the same functions for which it was originally built, including sheep shearing. The building is clearly still capable of fulfilling those functions since shearing still occurs in the space. True to the preservationist ideal, the practices enacted in the building have not experienced any mutilation at the hands of time. Likewise, Hardy stresses that the spirit of the ancient architects is united with that of the modern viewer, meaning that the historical building can foster human connections unbounded by time. The building contains human associations not only between the people of the present and the building, but also between humans in the present and in the past. This relation between the past and present hinges upon the functional continuity by which Hardy is satisfied. If the current occupants were not shearing just as their ancestors did, they would not experience the strong connection that they do by living out history. Ultimately, what is most important about the barn and about preservation in general is that the building achieves permanence. Mutability, the restorationist ally, destroys a building's history and severs those human connections that exist not only in the present, but also between the present and the past. The Great Barn is the ideal representation of preservation in action. In the Buck's Head Inn, fraternity is actively renewed. Like the Great Barn, the Buck's Head Inn is an ancient fixture of the architectural landscape. Quote, "At the roadside hamlet called Roy Town was the old inn Buck's Head. In the meridian times of stagecoach traveling had been the place where many coaches changed and kept their relays of horses. All the old stabling was now pulled down, and little remained besides the habitable inn itself. The manners of the inn were of the old established type. Indeed, in the minds of its frequenters, they existed as unalterable formulae. Yet, unlike the Great Barn, the Buck's Head no longer completely fulfills its original function. It is no longer a stop for stagecoaches, which has resulted in parts of the inn being altered. Yet the inn itself remains relatively unaltered. The manners in the inn are still the manners that have been long established, and like the Great Barn, possess a permanence that indicates their longevity. Although parts of the inn have been altered from their original condition, the heart of the inn remains mutable. It is in this unalterable heart of the inn, where human interactions remain much the same, that fraternity is maintained. Joseph Poorgrass has been conveying the body of the dead Fanny Robin for miles when he decides to stop at the friendly signboard of the Buck's Head Inn. There he meets two of his drinking acquaintances, Jan Coggin and Mark Clark. As Joseph relays his story of carting Fanny's body for several miles, Jan offers Joseph a drink and declares that drink is a pleasant delight, a truism so familiar to his brain that he hardly noticed its passage over his tongue. Consequently, even though Joseph's story is an unusual occurrence, his friend's response is a typical and expected one. Clearly, there is an established form of interaction that must take place when the men meet at the Buck's Head. This fraternity fosters loyalty, as becomes evident when Jan and Mark defend Joseph's drinking to Gabriel Oak. Gabriel enters the inn and is shocked to find Joseph drinking there, which to him is disgraceful. Yet Mark and Jan loyally defend Joseph. Mark tells Gabriel not to take on so, while Jan cries that nobody can hurt a dead woman. The woman's past us. Drink, shepherd, and be friends, for tomorrow we may be like her. When Joseph insists that the only thing wrong with him is a multiplying eye, Mark acquiesces and states that a multiplying eye is a very bad thing. Bonds of loyalty are thus formed by drinking together at the Buck's Head Inn. Jan and Mark are so devoted to Joseph that they will defend him out of a loyalty based upon the old established types of interaction they have with each other, drinking together, sharing stories, and repeating certain phrases. The Buck's Head therefore produces unbreakable bonds of fraternity and loyalty among its frequenters. This consistency in human relations mirrors the continuity of a preserved historical building. As Hardy has expressed with his description of the Great Barn, the ideal situation for a historical building is that the past and present achieve a seamlessly connected consistency. The old established manners of the inn are tied to its history as a building, since the power of those manners comes from their longevity and consistency. This moment at the Buck's Head Inn reveals the crucial parallel between loyal human connection and an unchanged architectural space. The architectural features of Weatherbury Church crucially preserve memories of Fanny Robin. Weatherbury Church, like the Great Barn and the Buck's Head Inn, is an ancient building, quote, of 14th century date, with two, quote, stone gargoyles on each of the four faces of its parapet. Only two of the gargoyles continue to serve the purpose of their erection, that of spouting the water from the lead roof within, but the two mouths which still remained open and active were gaping enough to do all the work. Except in a torrential downpour, which sends a, quote, persistent torrent onto Fanny Robin's grave. The flowers so carefully planted by Fanny's repentant lover, Sargent Troy, are washed away, and the rest of the tomb is splattered with, quote, stain of the brown mud. Troy, who has been sleeping by the grave, awakes to the scene of chaos and quickly becomes angry that, quote, Providence, far from helping him into a new course or showing any wish that he might adopt one, actually jeered his first trembling and critical attempt in that kind. He decides to, quote, throw up his cards and forswear his game for that time and always. Troy's efforts to maintain a beautiful tribute to Fanny's memory are thwarted by the architecture that is meant to preserve those memories. Had the gargoyles still been functioning and thus fulfilling their original purpose, they would not have concentrated all the rainwater into the one particular gargoyle that destroys Fanny's grave. Architecture, particularly useful practical architectural features like the gargoyles, must be allowed to maintain its original function, or else the memories meant to be associated with the building will be destroyed. This connection between function and human emotion contrasts sharply with restoration's focus on function devoid of human emotion. For restorationists, the most pressing need for a building was its ability to discharge its original function. Although Hardy wants the gargoyle to fulfill its function, he does not blame the structure of the gargoyle itself for its inability to accomplish its function. The reason that 4 of the 8 gargoyles no longer do what they were meant for is because bygone church wardens closed their superfluous mouth channels. Hardy thereby argues against the alteration of the gargoyle, since its original structure, were it left untouched, would be sufficient to fulfill its original function. Additionally, Hardy focuses on Troy's distress that Fanny's grave has been destroyed, rather than that the church's drainage system malfunctioned. Since the architecture of the church has been altered, this alteration results in an imperfect preservation of Fanny's memory. Hardy thereby creates a clear connection between architecture and memory. Memory can be altered without changing the architecture, but if the architecture changes, the memories must transform with it as well. Thus, Far from the Madding Crowd demonstrates prime instances of the emotional connections and memories forged by old buildings. Hardy's descriptions of architecture occur at moments where history, fraternity, and memories are kept alive, newly created, or even potentially destroyed. For Hardy, architecture is more than simply space. It is a repository for human connection.
Thank you, Carolina. That was fantastic. I really enjoyed that.